The cold wind had already begun to rise over Arroyo Vista when the convoy turned onto the narrow access road leading toward the canal district. Pale dust lifted behind the tires in slow spirals, drifting upward as if trying to escape the weight of what followed. Far ahead, sodium streetlights buzzed weakly over the water, their orange glow dissolving into the early morning darkness. Most of the town was still asleep, unaware that today would divide the quiet routine of Arroyo Vista into a before and an after. At the center of the convoy, a single patrol vehicle carried an older detective who had aged alongside this case. His hands rested still on his knees, but the tightening of his jaw showed how the moment pressed into him. For years, the canal paths had been a place of silence, where nothing happened, nothing changed, nothing confessed. But on this morning, the silence finally felt ready to break. They parked near a chain-link gate, the metal rattling sharply when the officers pushed it open. The path ahead stretched long and empty, framed by thick reeds and concrete walls stained with decades of mineral runoff. The air smelled of cold dust and water that never quite turned clean, the familiar scent of Arroyo Vista's irrigation system. Every officer who stepped onto the path carried the same unspoken thought. Something buried in the past was rising to meet them. A few feet ahead, the figure who had drawn them all here stood waiting beside a marked spot on the ground. He didn't speak until the others gathered, and even then he kept his voice low, as if afraid the canal would echo it back too loudly. He gestured toward the ground where a small evidence marker rested beside the edge of the embankment. Lying just beyond, it was a single item, worn and dusted by the night air. It looked simple and harmless in the dim light, but everyone present knew its history. A running shoe. The same brand, the same color, the same size as the one preserved in the evidence locker for 3 decades. It wasn't new, and it wasn't planted. It had surfaced unexpectedly during a routine maintenance sweep, uncovered when a section of the canal bank eroded overnight. A piece of the past, carried quietly through time, now returned to the open as if insisting the town remember what it tried so hard to forget. The detective stepped closer, careful not to disturb the ground. His breath formed a faint cloud in the cold. He stared at the shoe with a heaviness that did not belong to the moment alone, but to every year that came before it. In the early 1990s, 3 young runners were found murdered along this network of canals. Each time, a shoe remained at the scene, a single silent witness. These cases had aged into local cautionary tales, retold with soft voices and shorter details each passing year. But now, the past had offered an object whose timing could not be ignored. Behind him, officers murmured quietly as they set up perimeter markers, their movements steady and muted. The detective crouched and studied the shoe again, noticing the subtle marks along its sole, the frayed collar, the faint imprint of dried canal soil. It belonged here. It belonged to the past. And yet it had not vanished like everything else. It had waited. A faint rumble of engines approached from the distance. Another vehicle arrived, this one carrying the younger investigator, whose energy carried a completely different weight from the older detectives. This was the man who reopened the cold case 2 years earlier, the one who believed the files still held breath. He stepped out, scanned the path, and froze when his eyes reached the shoe. He walked toward it slowly, as though approaching something sacred. The older detective watched him, seeing a reflection of his younger self, someone who still believed every unanswered question could someday speak. The younger investigator knelt without touching the shoe, absorbing every detail. The stillness of the desert stretched around them, and the shallow trickle of water against concrete felt louder than usual, an unbroken rhythm beneath a moment suspended in time. He looked up at the older detective, and the question in his eyes required no words. Could this change everything? The older man lowered his head slightly, acknowledging what they both understood. For 30 years they had worked with the fragments left behind. Fibers, prints too faint to matter, stories too blurred by time to trust. But this item, resurfacing now, did not appear by coincidence. It felt tied to the truth they had finally begun to unravel through new forensic analysis. Other officers lifted evidence bags, measured soil patterns, and marked the terrain around the discovery. A quiet urgency drifted through the group, a sense that this was not just another piece of debris washed ashore. It was a reminder, a push, a turning of the wheel. The desert does not give back without reason. The younger investigator stood and looked out across the canal, his breath steadying as the reality settled in. The arrest made earlier that week, the DNA match. The name Dale Hargrove had already shaken Arroyo Vista, but now, with the shoe uncovered at the water's edge, the story felt less like a case and more like a long collapsed bridge beginning to rise from the dust. The officers prepared to leave, the evidence sealed, the scene logged. The horizon began to lighten as the first streaks of morning stretched across the sky. The canal water carried a faint shimmer, and the wind pushed gently through the reeds, as though acknowledging the weight of what had just been found. The older detective paused for a final glance at the path before turning back toward the convoy. A truth long buried was finally surfacing, piece by piece, object by object, returning to those who never stopped listening. To understand how this began, we go back to 1992. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. The small house on Mariposa Lane never felt silent when Lena was in it. She filled it with the kind of movement that didn't demand attention. The soft shuffle of preparing breakfast before sunrise, the steady rhythm of sorting papers for her counseling, worked the gentle hum she made when thinking through a problem. Her parents often said the house breathed differently when she was home, as if her presence gave it a pulse. Every morning began with the same ritual. She woke before the streetlights turned off, pushing aside the thin curtains to check the familiar stretch of desert sky. If the horizon carried even a faint hint of pale blue, she would take it as a sign that the day was hers to shape. She enjoyed those early hours when the world still felt undecided, when shadows clung to fences and the air smelled clean before the heat settled in. She would make coffee in a chipped mug painted with faded sunflowers, a gift from one of her students years earlier, and stand barefoot on the cool tile floor, sipping slowly while her thoughts arranged themselves. Her work as a school counselor filled most of her days. She wasn't the kind who spoke loudly or commanded a room. Instead, she listened with an attentiveness that made others feel safe. Children confided in her without being asked. Parents trusted her with the kind of conversations they usually reserved for close friends. And her colleagues often remarked that Lena seemed born for the job, that her quiet steadiness was exactly what the school needed. In her office, a small shelf displayed a collection of items her students had given her: a friendship bracelet, a hand-drawn card, a small clay turtle with uneven eyes, a knitted bookmark. To anyone else, they looked like scraps of childhood creativity. To Lena, they were reminders of why she stayed late most evenings, sorting through student files under the dim yellow glow of her desk lamp. The shelf felt like her own constellation of stories, each piece connected to a child she had helped navigate something difficult. Despite how much she gave to others, Lena carried a personal ritual that belonged entirely to herself: running. It was her grounding, her way of clearing the emotional noise of the day. Every evening, just as the sun slid behind the low rooftops and cast a warm line across the canal path, she tied her running shoes. The same pair she used for months, never quite ready to replace them even as the fabric softened. She liked the feel of shoes that had molded to her stride. Before each run, she paused by the doorway, rolling her shoulders, taking one breath to center herself. Her parents often watched from the kitchen, knowing better than to question why she ran alone. In Arroyo Vista, the canal paths were considered safe enough. The town was small, predictable. Everyone knew the cadence of their neighbors' routines, and Lena's was one of the most consistent. Her friendships reflected the same quiet reliability. She often met her closest friend, Clarissa, at a small cafe near the school. They would sit outside with iced drinks, sharing stories about work, family quirks, and the occasional frustration that came with living in a place where nothing changed. Clarissa teased Lena about her old running shoes, saying she would eventually run them into the ground. Lena would laugh softly, brushing a bit of dust off the toe before explaining she liked things that earned their wear. Shoes, she said, told a story if you used them long enough. The Marquez home carried its own collection of small symbolic moments. A framed photo of Lena as a teenager crossing the finish line of a local charity run. A drawer filled with notepads where she logged her routes and times, not because she wanted to compete, but because she enjoyed seeing progress. The kitchen corkboard pinned with reminders and encouraging quotes she wrote for herself on sticky notes. Everything about her life reflected an intentional kind of simplicity, built on routine and quiet determination. Her mother often described Lena as someone who lived from the inside out. She didn't chase attention or seek applause. She simply did what she believed mattered, and she did it with her whole heart. That sincerity made her absence, later, feel like a sudden hole in the landscape, something unthinkably ordinary that had been ripped away. The day before she disappeared followed the same pattern as many others, but carried small details that lingered afterward in the memories of people who loved her. She started the morning at the school, meeting with a student who had been struggling in class. The conversation seemed to go well, and Lena left work that day with a lightness her coworkers noticed. She stopped at the grocery store on her way home, picking up fresh oranges and a box of herbal tea her father liked. She cooked dinner with her parents, listening to her mother describe a family friend's upcoming visit. There was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Later that evening, she went to her room, lit a small lavender candle on her desk, and wrote a few lines in her running log. The candle had become another quiet ritual for her, something peaceful to end the day. She wrote about her students, about her plans to adjust her running route slightly, and about how she wished for cooler evenings because the heat had been wearing her down. The candle flame flickered gently as she wrote, the warm light brushing against the walls. When she stepped out onto the porch, ready to run, the air felt cooler than usual. The desert wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant creosote bushes. She reached down and tied her laces with practiced efficiency, double knotting them as she always did. Her father asked if she wanted him to walk with her for the first stretch. She smiled, shaking her head softly, reminding him she'd be fine and that she wouldn't be gone long. That was the last time they saw her. She jogged down the quiet street, past houses whose porch lights blinked lazily, past dogs that stirred in their yards, past the familiar turn where the concrete path met the canal. The sky above her was a deepening blue, streaked with the last traces of sunlight. Her stride settled into an easy rhythm. She carried no music, no phone, just her thoughts and the comforting repetition of her feet against the ground. Neighbors later recalled seeing her near the canal, moving with her usual calm focus. No one noticed anything strange. No shouts, no pause, no sign of hesitation. She simply ran into the warm desert twilight, carried forward by the trust she had always given this place. What happened next would forever divide her life into the part everyone remembered and the part no one saw. But in those final moments before she turned onto the secluded stretch, where the reeds grew tall and the streetlights thinned, she was exactly who she had always been. Steady, hopeful, and unaware that this ordinary run would become a point of silence her family never fully escaped. The evening Lena stepped onto the canal path for the last time carried an unfamiliar stillness, the kind that settles over a town without asking permission. The heat of the day had finally drained from the concrete, leaving the air cool enough to carry distant sounds more sharply than usual. She moved with her steady rhythm, feet brushing against the dust-coated ground as she followed the same route she had taken hundreds of times before. Each step blended into the next, measured and unhurried, her breath even as the sky deepened toward a warm shade of violet. The timeline that followed, reconstructed through witness accounts, environmental data, and later forensic estimates, begins shortly after she turned past the cottonwood trees that marked the entrance to the more secluded section of the canal. The time was approximately 7:42 p.m., the final orange thread of sunlight clinging to the horizon. A utility worker from a nearby substation recalled hearing soft footfalls along the path, steady and light at roughly that same moment. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just the familiar cadence of a regular runner. By 7:48 p.m., the streetlights along the canal flickered on in staggered intervals. They cast elongated halos across the water, breaking into trembling reflections. Between the lights, pockets of darkness formed empty spaces where visibility dropped sharply. Lena passed through these transitions as she always did, her pace neither slowing nor quickening. She reached the long bend near the drainage culvert, a point where the reeds grew taller than most people and the concrete wall dipped slightly. It was a place where sound changed character, where footsteps softened and water echoed more closely. The timeline after 7:48 p.m. begins to blur. A resident walking his dog on the parallel street later said he heard something like a short gasp or startled exhale around 7:50. Not a scream, not a cry for help. Just a quick, sharp sound that didn't repeat. He dismissed it at the time, thinking it belonged to one of the desert birds that often startled along the canal. But investigators would eventually mark his statement as a possible point of contact, a moment where something shifted in the silence. Further along the path, at approximately 7:52 p.m., a faint scuff mark was later found near the concrete edge, an angled drag in the dust, as if someone had pivoted abruptly or stumbled. The dirt around it showed no signs of a prolonged fight, no clear struggle, no obvious indication of where the person moved next. The mark simply existed by itself, an isolated gesture etched into desert soil. From 7:52 to 8:04 p.m., there's no verified sound, sighting, or trace. The absence in this stretch of time became one of the most unsettling aspects of the early investigation. The path was quiet. The houses along the adjacent road were preparing for dinner or winding down, and no one paid much attention to the darkening sky or the water's slow movement. In those 12 minutes, whatever happened to Lena took place out of sight, but not out of reach of the clues she left behind. The discovery timeline begins the next morning at 6:11 a.m., when a canal maintenance worker named Raymond Ortega arrived for his shift. His routine was as consistent as Lena's had been: unlock the small service gate, check the water flow measurements, and walk the path with a long-handled rake to clear debris from the edges. He preferred the early hours, when the sun hadn't fully risen and the town was still half asleep. As he moved along the path, he noticed something unusual near the base of the concrete slope. At first, it looked like discarded clothing. But as he walked closer, the shape sharpened into something unmistakable: a body lying partly in the reeds, half on the embankment and half near the waterline. He stopped, breath catching for a moment before training took over. Setting his rake aside, he moved closer with caution, his boots crunching lightly over the thin crust of dirt. He called for help immediately, his voice steady but tight, reporting what he saw with the clarity of someone who understood the gravity of his discovery. The first deputies arrived minutes later. They secured the area and began studying the scene with careful, deliberate steps. Lena lay on her right side, her body angled slightly toward the canal as though she had been moving downhill. Her arms were bent in a posture that didn't fully match a fall. One detail stood out immediately, a detail that would become the signature of the case. She was missing one shoe. Her left shoe was still on her foot, tied in the familiar double knot she always used. The right shoe was gone. The ground near her held faint imprints of movement, but nothing distinct enough to track. The deputies scanned the area for the missing shoe, searching along the reeds, the slope, the drainage culvert, and the water line. They found nothing. The position of the body raised questions from the start. The lack of visible trauma, the absence of extensive drag marks, and the peculiar silence of the previous night made the scene feel incomplete. Investigators documented everything: the texture of the soil beneath her, The angle of the reeds bent behind her, the thin layer of dust coating her clothing. Even the air temperature from the previous night was logged to estimate time of death. By 7:05 a.m., the investigative team had expanded. A forensic specialist surveyed the scene, noting the footprints scattered nearby, some belonging to Ortega, others likely from joggers who had passed earlier. Among those prints were partial impressions that did not match Lena's running pattern or shoe type. They lacked depth, as though made by someone moving quickly but not heavily. The impressions were too incomplete to cast, but they were recorded photographically and referenced later as possible traces of another person present on the path. The canal water carried its own quiet secrets. Thin strands of vegetation adhered to the concrete, some torn recently. Soil samples were collected along the slope where the ground appeared disturbed. A faint streak of dust crossed one section of concrete, angled in a way that suggested sudden sideways movement. These details, small and fragmented, shaped the early reconstruction of events. The search for the missing shoe continued throughout the morning. Officers spread out along the canal, walking several hundred feet in each direction. They checked the embankment and the bushes along the parallel road. They dragged a small net along the shallow canal, lifting out debris and silt. Still, nothing surfaced. The absence of the shoe quickly transformed from a minor detail into an essential piece of the puzzle. It suggested contact, an abrupt disruption to her movement. Shoes do not simply vanish during a run. They come off because someone pulls, grabs, twists, or tugs with force. Yet the scene lacked signs of a prolonged struggle. It was as if someone had approached Lena at the precise moment when light and shadow overlapped and separated her from view, acted swiftly, and left behind nothing but the incompleteness of a single missing object. Later analysis revealed a few more details. A tiny fiber was found near her remaining shoe, clinging to the edge of the laces. It did not match her clothing. Another small detail emerged in the soil sample collected near the drainage culvert, a faint trace of skin cells. Too few to identify at the time, but enough to warrant preservation. These fragments would eventually become part of the larger forensic story in the years ahead. The immediate investigation focused on collecting everything the desert had not yet erased. The desert preserves and destroys in equal measure, keeping some details intact while scattering others in the wind. Lena's watch recorded her last movement at 7:51 p.m., its motion sensor ceasing activity abruptly. The time aligned closely with the witness who heard the faint gasp, adding another piece to the timeline. By noon, the deputies expanded their search perimeter. In the tall reeds just beyond a split in the path, they found a faint indentation, as though someone had stood there recently. Nearby, a thin line of disturbed dust stretched toward the canal, interrupted suddenly before reaching the slope. This odd pattern would later puzzle investigators. It hinted at movement, but lacked the depth or clarity to determine direction or intent. The last significant detail of the day emerged when an officer exploring farther down the canal noticed a partial shoe print near a patch of dried mud. It did not match Lena's shoes. It also did not match any known brand worn by the maintenance workers. The print was incomplete, missing the toe section and part of the heel, but the midsole pattern was distinct enough to log. It became one of the earliest unresolved details of the case, filed in the L-Series evidence catalog under possible 30 trace. As the day ended and the investigators finished their initial survey, the scene remained eerily quiet. The sun climbed high, casting sharp light over the canal, washing away the softness of morning and replacing it with harsh clarity. The reeds swayed lightly, the water trickled in its usual rhythm, and the pathway stretched forward as though indifferent to what it had witnessed. But the unanswered questions lingered: the missing shoe, the faint drag mark, the partial footprint that did not belong, the sudden stillness of her watch. All of these elements hung in the air, waiting for the kind of answers that would not come for many years. And among them was one particular detail the investigators could not resolve that day. A detail small enough to overlook, a single, Narrow scratch on the concrete slope, angled sharply downward. It was too thin to match a typical scuff from running, and its direction suggested a movement inconsistent with Lena's stride. It sat quietly at the edge of the scene, recorded but not understood, a fragment pointing toward something no one yet knew how to see. For weeks after Lena's body was found, the investigation moved with a sense of urgency that made the small sheriff's office feel busier than it had in years. Deputies worked long shifts, sorting statements, mapping routes, and cataloging every trace the desert hadn't already claimed. At first, there was a belief that the case would break quickly, that someone must have seen something, that a footprint or fiber would point them toward the person responsible. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the case began to feel heavier, as though each unanswered question pulled it down. The first false lead arrived within 48 hours. A man in his 40s, known in the neighborhood for unpredictable behavior, had been seen walking along the canal around the time Lena was believed to have been attacked. Deputies brought him in for questioning. He spoke rapidly, nervously, insisting that he had simply been out looking for his lost dog. His story wavered, but every detail he gave eventually matched what neighbors had seen. His shoes didn't match the partial imprint found near the reeds. His clothing carried no trace of canal soil. He was released a day later, muttering about how everyone in town always blamed him when something went wrong. Another lead emerged from a call placed by a jogger who reported seeing a tall figure moving through the reeds on the night of the murder. The caller described someone wearing dark clothing and carrying what looked like a bag. Investigators combed the area again, searching for any sign of a dropped item or torn fabric. They found nothing but wind-bent reeds and dust stirred by their own boots. Interviews with people in nearby homes uncovered no one suspicious, no one carrying a bag that evening, and no one who matched the caller's vague description. The lid dissolved into uncertainty, leaving behind only a note in the case file. Possibly misinterpreted shadow. The partial shoe print found farther down the canal path generated its own flurry of theories. A shoe print meant movement, direction, weight. It was something tangible. Investigators brought in shoe design catalogs, studied tread patterns, and visited local stores to compare brands. They questioned workers, runners, teenagers who cut through the canal as a shortcut. Nothing matched. The print lacked the clarity they needed. It was like trying to reconstruct a face from a single eyelash. By mid-autumn, the department circulated a composite sketch based on the dog-walking witness, who thought he had seen a man near the culvert that night. The sketch appeared in local newspapers and on flyers stapled to telephone poles. For a brief moment, the phones at the sheriff's office rang constantly. People called in names, suspicions, grudges. One man claimed that the sketch resembled a co-worker at his warehouse job who gave him a bad feeling. Another insisted it looked like a drifter she had seen rummaging near dumpsters. Deputies interviewed each person, one by one, only to find alibis or descriptions that didn't fully match. The sketch turned from a hopeful lead into a symbol of how easily fear could mold a face into whatever people wanted to see. Inside the Marquez home, pain settled into the walls with a quiet persistence. Lena's parents met weekly with detectives for updates that increasingly contained fewer new details. Once, her mother asked, "Do you think she was frightened?" The detective paused before answering, knowing that even the gentlest words could wound. "We don't have evidence she suffered long," he said, choosing the narrowest truth. Her father gripped the table, his knuckles tight. Conversations with the family grew shorter over time, not because they lost interest, but because every repeated uncertainty added another layer of grief that no one could soften. Reporters began showing up outside the sheriff's office in clusters. They wanted a story, a narrative, a villain. They asked questions that assumed answers existed. Was this a pattern? Was the killer someone local? Were the canals safe? The sheriff gave controlled responses. "We are exploring all leads," he said repeatedly. But as winter approached, the news vans stopped appearing, turning their attention to newer tragedies elsewhere. Arroyo Vista returned to its routine, though a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface, visible in the way people locked their doors earlier or avoided the canal at dusk. In early spring, the investigation took another turn when a man visiting family reported seeing a stranger hiding near the canal weeks before the murder. Deputies tracked down the man he described, a construction worker living temporarily in town. He had no connection to Lena, no record of violence, and his work logs placed him at job sites during the times the first two victims in nearby counties had been found months earlier. The lead, initially promising, became another dead end. Throughout the next few months, deputies revisited every detail of the crime scene. They re-examined soil samples, hoping to detect anything unusual. They retested the fiber found near Lena's shoe, but the technology available at the time could only identify its general category. It was synthetic, common, and impossible to trace to a specific garment. The faint skin cells found near the drainage culvert provided no usable DNA profile. Despite their efforts, the puzzle remained incomplete. The burden of the case weighed heavily on the investigative team. One deputy, younger than the rest, confided to a colleague, "I keep thinking there's something we walked right past." Another detective, older and worn from years of similar heartbreaks, responded with quiet resignation, "Every case like this feels like that. Sometimes the desert keeps its secrets." As months turned into a year, the pace of the investigation slowed. Files were stacked neatly in the cold case cabinet, labeled and sealed. The whiteboard filled with timelines, sketches, and maps was wiped clean. Conversations with potential suspects dwindled. Lena's name still appeared in internal briefings, but the frequency lessened as new cases demanded attention. Her case was not forgotten, but it shifted into a place occupied by unresolved stories, still open, still important, but no longer receiving daily scrutiny. Families from the town held a small vigil at the canal on the anniversary of Lena's death. They lit candles, placed flowers, and shared memories. Her mother held Lena's remaining running shoe in her hands throughout the service. When someone asked why she brought it, she whispered, "Because this was the last thing she touched before the dark." The weight of the shoe, soft and worn from years of use, seemed almost symbolic of the time that had passed without answers. Another investigative surge came when a second woman, from a neighboring community, was found near a canal with a missing shoe, echoing Lena's case. Investigators traveled to examine the scene, hoping for a connection. But the similarities faded under closer inspection. The second woman had died from a medical emergency unrelated to any attack. Her missing shoe had been carried off by a stray dog. The sheriff's office documented the case, but the lead collapsed within a day. Rumors began spreading around town, whispered in grocery store aisles and exchanged across backyard fences. Some people believed a serial predator was haunting the canals. Others thought the absence of evidence proved the killer was someone respected, someone shielded by silence. A few insisted Lena must have encountered a stranger from outside the community. These theories circled constantly, shifting shape depending on who told them, none supported by tangible proof. Years passed, and the case transitioned fully into cold status. Files were shifted to the lower shelves of the cold case archive. Detectives rotated through departments or retired. One veteran officer, who had been among the first on the scene, kept Lena's case file tucked in the corner of his desk for years, even when he no longer worked active investigations. When asked why, he would simply say, "Some cases need someone to remember them." Meanwhile, the Marquez family continued their quiet rituals. On holidays, they set an extra place at the table. On Lena's birthday, they drove to the canal and left fresh flowers. Her mother occasionally took out the running log from her daughter's room, reading the last entries again and again, as though studying them might reveal something she had missed. Her father oiled the hinges on her bedroom door, keeping it from sticking, though it rarely opened. Detectives did attempt one more major review in the late 90s, when new forensic tools became available. They resubmitted soil samples, re-examined the fibers, and tried to extract DNA from the faint skin cells. The results came back inconclusive. The technology wasn't yet capable of coaxing clarity from such small degraded material. Hopes rose briefly, only to be grounded again. The partial footprint remained unresolved. A note in the margin of the report read, "Unknown third-party presence." Insufficient detail. It was all they could say. The strange thin scratch on the concrete, recorded in early logs, was eventually dismissed as an artifact of erosion. The drag mark was attributed to either Lena or natural shifting of the soil. Piece by piece, the details collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. By the early 2000s, the case resurged briefly when a man was arrested in a nearby city for attacking a jogger. His profile seemed to fit the shadows in the case files. Solitary, physically strong, familiar with canal routes. Deputies interviewed him extensively. He admitted to many things in his past, but when asked about Lena, his answers never changed. "I wasn't there," he said repeatedly. His alibi was verified. Another dead end, another name crossed off the list. Resource constraints began to shape decisions. Files needed space. Cases needed prioritization. And in a small town where violent crime was rare, budget and personnel shifts gradually pushed older cases further out of reach. The sheriff eventually announced during a routine briefing, "We have exhausted all active leads. If new information arises, we will reopen the case immediately." It was the official sentence for a file that had resisted every attempt to unlock it. The Marquez family received the news quietly. Lena's mother thanked the detectives for their efforts, even though the exhaustion in her eyes revealed how much the words cost her. Her father nodded silently, gripping the edge of his chair as though the room had tilted slightly. The investigation file was placed on the shelf, the label facing outward, marked by the date it transitioned into cold status. And for many years afterward, whenever someone opened the storage room door, there it sat, still and undisturbed, waiting in the dim light like a story half told and half forgotten. The unresolved details, the missing shoe, the faint scratch, the partial print, remained trapped inside those pages. Without new evidence or breakthroughs, the case settled into its long, quiet sleep. At the bottom of the final internal memo from that era, a tired detective wrote a single line, "Nothing left to follow." And with that, the file closed not with answers, but with the weight of defeat. In the months after Lena's death, the Marquez home became quieter, as though sound itself had learned to walk gently through its rooms. At first, friends and neighbors visited often, bringing food, flowers, and soft-voiced condolences. Cards filled the kitchen counter. Bouquets wilted slowly. The house absorbed all of it with the stillness of a place learning to carry a new kind of weight. But slowly, inevitably, the visits faded, and the world outside continued moving at its ordinary pace. Her parents, Marta and Daniel, remained anchored in the life they had built with their daughter. The hallway still held framed photos of her smiling at the finish line of a charity run. Her bedroom remained neat, the way she kept it, with the lavender candle on the desk and her notebook stacked at the corner. They couldn't bring themselves to pack anything away. Instead, the room became a quiet sanctuary, a space where time paused each time they stepped inside. For the first year, Marta wrote letters that she never mailed. She folded them and kept them in a drawer beside her bed, each one addressed to Lena in handwriting that trembled slightly more each month. The letters were simple, full of everyday thoughts. "Your father fixed the roof. I made your favorite, stew. The sunset looked like the one you light from the porch." They were ways of maintaining a connection she refused to let disappear completely. Over time, the drawer filled with stacks of these letters, each one carrying a piece of her voice. Daniel's grief looked different. He rose early each day and walked the canal path alone. He never went far, but he followed the first stretch that Lena had taken countless times. He stopped at the bend where the streetlight dimmed slightly and stood there for long minutes, breathing in the chilly morning air. Some days he spoke quietly, as though she might hear him. Other days he stood silent, staring at the slow movement of the water, remembering the evenings when her footsteps echoed along the concrete. The town itself shifted gradually. More houses were built, new families moved in. Children who once knew Lena as their school counselor grew up and left for colleges or jobs in larger cities. The canal path, once filled with evening runners, became a less traveled route as caution settled into the habits of the town. Some joggers changed their routines. Others avoided the path completely after dusk. Years accumulated with the subtle weight of sediment, layer by layer. Lena's friends married, had children, pursued careers. Sometimes they visited her parents, always with a sense of stepping into a place where time didn't flow the same way. They found it difficult to talk about their lives without feeling like they were moving too quickly past someone who never had the chance. Yet Marta and Daniel listened warmly, grateful for the reminders that Lena's world had once been full of people she loved. A few reporters revisited the case from time to time, mostly around anniversaries. They interviewed the Marquez family politely, cautiously. They asked if the family believed justice would ever come. Marta always answered with quiet certainty. "Someone knows something," she said. "And truth waits." Her calmness often unsettled the reporters, who expected anger or despair. But grief had reshaped her. She carried it without disguising it, yet without allowing it to consume her. Daniel, on the other hand, seldom spoke during those interviews. He sat in his chair with his hands clasped tightly, looking down as if he were trying to hold on to memories without letting them slip through. Sometimes, after the reporters left, he would retrieve Lena's remaining running shoe from the shelf in the living room. He held it gently, running his thumb along the softened edge, thinking of the miles it had carried her. It became a ritual of its own, a way of keeping part of her presence tangible. As the early 2000s arrived, technology evolved in ways that briefly rekindled hope. News stories circulated about improved DNA analysis and breakthroughs in cold cases across the country. Marta clipped these articles and kept them in a small folder. She read them over and over, imagining what might happen if someone reopened her daughter's file. She once asked a detective during a routine update, "Could this help Lena?" The detective replied carefully, "Maybe someday. We just don't have the tools here yet." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't refusal either. That sliver of possibility sustained Marta in quiet, steady ways. Time left visible marks on the Marquez family. Marta's hair thinned and grayed. Daniel's hands, once steady from years of carpentry work, began to tremble slightly. Their voices softened, their movements slowed, but their devotion to Lena never wavered. They continued setting an extra place at the dinner table on special occasions. They kept her photograph on the mantel, dusting it regularly. Some nights they lit the lavender candle she kept in her room, letting its familiar scent fill the hallway. Meanwhile, Lena's absence resonated through the town in subtler ways. Each passing year brought new faces to Arroyo Vista, people who never knew her, who learned about the case only through cautious whispers or faded newspaper clippings tucked into scrapbooks. Children who once left flowers along the canal grew into adults who told their own children to avoid running alone. The case became both a memory and a warning, woven quietly into the culture of the place. A journalist named Sarah Thompson developed a particular interest in the story during her internship at a regional paper. She visited the Marquez home, spoke with Lena's former colleagues, and spent many hours reading through archived articles. She wrote a short anniversary piece titled "Miles Unfinished," highlighting the community's quiet resilience. Though the article didn't bring new leads, it added another layer to the collective remembrance. Sarah's interest faded as her career took her elsewhere, but her article remained clipped on the Marquez refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a small ceramic turtle, a gift from one of Lena's students long ago. By the mid-2000s, the case file sat untouched for long stretches of time. Deputies came and went. Offices reorganized. New computers replaced old ones, and cardboard boxes were swapped for plastic bins. But the cold case evidence remained sealed exactly as it had been, tucked behind other unsolved files, marked by its faded label. Dust settled on the edges. The air in the storage room stayed cool and still, preserving what time couldn't erase. Around this time, the Marquez family began making fewer public appearances. They grew quieter, more private. Their grief had matured into something less visible, but no less present. They still walked to the canal on Lena's birthday, placing flowers near the water. Sometimes Marta would sit on the ground with her hands resting in her lap, looking out at the ripples moving slowly along the concrete. She imagined Lena running there again, her steps light and purposeful. A noticeable shift happened years later when new forensic possibilities reached wider public attention. People started sharing news stories about genealogical databases helping solve decades-old murders. Marta clipped them too, adding them to her growing folder. Each time she read a new headline, she whispered to herself, "Maybe next year." Daniel remained cautious, though not dismissive. He had learned to protect himself with silence, but he still followed Marta to the mailbox to check for updates from the sheriff's office. Life continued, not forward in leaps, but in steady, patient steps. The Marquez home aged alongside them. Paint peeled slightly on the porch railings. The garden grew untamed at the edges. But inside, Lena's room stayed almost untouched. Marta dusted the windowsill every Friday, smoothing the curtain gently afterward. She still kept her daughter's running log open to the last page, the handwriting she knew so well frozen in time. Years blurred into one another until Arroyo Vista began to feel like a town straddling two timelines: the present, full of new construction and young families, and the past, carried quietly by those who remembered. The canals, once symbols of fear, became just another feature of the landscape. Yet every so often, someone jogging past the cottonwood trees would pause, sensing a memory they had heard secondhand. Then, unexpectedly, a small moment of hope emerged. A junior investigator named Evan Calder joined the sheriff's office. Young, methodical, and deeply curious, he found himself drawn to the cold case cabinet during his downtime. One day, while reorganizing files, he noticed the old cardboard label on Lena's case, the faded ink. The weight of years pressed into the edges. He opened it carefully, reading through each page with the kind of patience the case hadn't felt in decades. He paused at the evidence log describing the torn running shoe and the fingernail scraping, labeled with a cautionary note about degraded material. He looked up, the quiet room reflecting back the stillness that had surrounded the file for so long. He knew newer forensic techniques had changed how even the faintest samples could be read. He thought about what might still be hidden inside those evidence bags. That night, he stayed late in the office, scanning through recent articles about advancements in DNA amplification. His mind kept circling back to the shoe, the scrap of material inside its torn collar, the skin cells near the culvert. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet moment, this small decision to read deeper, would become the first spark of the breakthrough waiting on the horizon. By then, the Marquez family had grown older and more fragile. Their nights were long, their steps slower, but their hope had never fully dimmed. When Marta checked the mailbox the next morning, she found no letters, no updates. Still, she whispered her familiar line, "Maybe next year." She closed the box gently, unaware that the year she hoped for was finally beginning to turn in their favor. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. For nearly 3 decades, the evidence bin containing Lena's running shoe sat in the cold case archive like something tucked away by time itself. The label faded. The cardboard softened. Newer investigators walked past it without noticing, shelving fresher files around it as the years rearranged priorities. Yet despite the dust, despite the silence, nothing inside the bin had changed. It waited with the quiet patience of an object that still carried truth. Detective Evan Calder discovered the bin late one evening after weeks of reorganizing old files. He had grown used to the steady quiet of the evidence room, where a hum of air vents and the smell of paper created a sense of suspended years. But when his flashlight beam brushed over the name Marquez, he stopped as if he had touched an exposed wire. He knelt, pulled the bin forward, and lifted the lid with deliberate care, expecting little. What he found instead pulled him into the center of a story he had only known from whispers. The shoe lay wrapped in 2 layers of original evidence, plastic well preserved, sealed tight, the fabric still bearing the faint dust of the canal path. He noticed the torn edge on the inner collar, the frayed seams, the softened sole. The tear looked almost surgical, as if time had opened a doorway into the past. He read the old log entry, possible biological trace, but the note that followed reflected limitations of the early 90s. Sample too degraded for analysis. Calder reread the words twice. Today, that line no longer held weight. Technology had changed everything. He wrote a request for reevaluation, logged the evidence transfer, and scheduled a DNA review with the State Forensic Laboratory. It was the kind of paperwork that rarely stirred excitement, yet he felt an undercurrent of something awakening, a sense that the file he held might be carrying more than worn fabric. A week later, Calder stood behind a viewing window at the Santa Fe Forensic Lab while technicians began their work. The laboratory felt like another world, colder, cleaner, lit by soft blue-white brightness that made every detail visible. The scientists moved with quiet precision, their gloved hands steady as they unsealed the plastic under airflow filters. Lena's shoe looked smaller under the sterile lights, almost fragile. The tear along the inner collar, where a handful of cells might have once clung, drew their immediate attention. The first stage was microscopic extraction. A small suction tool, about the size of a stylus, hovered over the torn fabric, pulling up particulates invisible to the eye. The cartridge attached to the tool filled slowly with what appeared to be nothing at all: dust, fibers, fragments. But Calder knew better. Cold cases often turned on fragments. Next came the amplification process. The cartridge was placed into a machine designed to isolate even the weakest biological materials. The hum of the equipment vibrated lightly through the floor. The machine cycled heat and pressure in tiny increments, coaxing out molecular signals from a sample nearly 30 years old. The lab technicians monitored the readings without speaking, watching as graphs rose and fell. Then, at a little after noon, one of the graphs shifted. A line appeared faint at first, but unmistakable. A partial DNA profile, human, male. Calder felt a tension release from somewhere deep inside him. Not relief, not victory. Just a long-awaited proof that something buried in the past had finally surfaced. The technicians repeated the procedure twice to confirm the result. Each time, the data strengthened. They extracted a second profile from the preserved fingernail scraping, still stored with the case. Another weak sample, another long shot. But newer technology made the impossible routine. And when the results emerged a few hours later, they found what no one in 1993 could have imagined. The same male contributor appeared in both samples. 2 separate pieces of evidence, 3 decades old, now pointed to one individual. The next step was uploading the profile to the National DNA database. It was a task that felt deceptively simple. All it required was a digital submission. But Calder understood the significance. The difference between an open wound and a scar finally starting to close. He authorized the upload, signed the final form, thanked the technicians, and stepped outside into the cool dusk air. He didn't sleep much that night. His phone remained on the kitchen counter, volume high, the room dark except for the faint light from the street. Every few hours he walked past the phone, imagining it ringing, imagining what might come next. Just after 8 the next morning, the call arrived. Not dramatic, not even loud, a simple alert, a name appearing on the screen. He answered immediately. The voice on the other end was steady. "We have a match. He asked them to repeat it. They did. Same calm tone. Same devastating clarity. The DNA linked to a man named Dale Hargrove, a mechanic with a small shop in Arroyo Vista. A man with no violent criminal history, no reputation for aggression, no one who had ever surfaced in the original investigation. He had been arrested in the late 90s for a bar altercation, an unremarkable event that led to a routine cheek swab, which sat unnoticed in the database for nearly 20 years. Calder sat at his kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, absorbing the reality of the revelation. The name didn't match any earlier theories. Hargrove wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a drifter or someone passing through. He lived in the same community as Lena. He had worked there for decades. He had driven past the canals hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Some cases falter because the suspect is too clever. Others fall apart because the evidence disappears. But this case had waited for something else entirely: science to evolve. The report from the lab expanded the story even further. The degradation patterns of the DNA indicated quick, forceful contact skin shearing under pressure, not casual transfer. The evidence had not endured because of careful preservation, but because the sample had been sealed, untouched, carried forward like a message stored in a bottle. A time capsule within fabric. Calder returned to Arroyo Vista the next day to begin building the timeline for Hargrove. Deputies conducted interviews. They examined his old vehicles. They reviewed his work logs from the early 90s. Each step brought smaller details to the surface details that made sense in hindsight. He had lived less than a mile from the stretch of canal where Lena jogged daily. He often worked late at his shop, sometimes walking home along the surface roads. His schedule matched gaps in the timeline. His physical build matched faint impressions of the shoe print collected years before. When investigators arrived at his home to arrest him, neighbors watched from their porches, stunned. Some said they had always thought Hargrove seemed quiet. Others said they barely knew him. One elderly neighbor whispered, "He was always polite." Another shook his head, repeating, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it's him." Calder attended the search of Hargrove's small, cluttered workshop. Grease-stained tools hung in neat rows. Car parts filled every corner. Nothing about the room suggested a connection to violence, yet truth doesn't always leave visible marks. It sometimes hides in plain sight, waiting for the right lens to expose it. Word reached the Marquez family later that afternoon. Calder chose to deliver the news in person. Marta answered the door slowly, as though prepared for disappointment. But when she saw Calder's expression, her breath caught and her hand rose instinctively to her chest. He spoke gently, clearly. "We have a DNA match. It's strong. It's real." For a moment, she closed her eyes, and the lines on her face deepened with the weight of 30 years of grief. Daniel stepped into the doorway behind her, silent but alert, waiting for words he had once believed might never come. Calder continued, "We've made an arrest." Marta's lips parted, but no sound came. She nodded once, twice before reaching for a chair. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her as she absorbed the news that had reshaped the world around them. Later, when the sun dipped low and the house grew quiet, Marta walked to Lena's room. She lit the lavender candle her daughter once used, letting the soft fragrance drift across the shelves. She touched the running shoe on the dresser, the one Lena tied on her final night. It no longer felt like a relic of loss. It felt like a companion to the shoe still locked in evidence, the shoe that had carried the truth across decades. Justice hadn't arrived quickly. It hadn't arrived cleanly or without pain. But it had found its way, carried by science, memory, and a single object that refused to disappear. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning of the arrest began without ceremony. Officers waited outside the small workshop where Dale Hargrove had spent most of his adult life repairing engines, polishing chrome, and keeping mostly to himself. The building looked worn, its paint faded to a pale, sunburned red. A single metal door faced the street, and behind it, the faint clatter of tools rose and fell in steady rhythm. It was a place that hadn't changed in decades, a place that seemed untouched by the passage of time or suspicion. When the officers knocked, the sound carried through the workshop like a sudden break in continuity. Hargrove turned from the workbench, wiped his hands on a rag, and opened the door with the caution of someone expecting a parts delivery. Instead, he found himself looking at uniforms, badges, and the calm face of Detective Calder, who stood centered in the group. Calder spoke with formal clarity. "Dale Hargrove, you are under arrest." The words fell into the morning air with the quiet thud of inevitability. Hargrove's expression flickered surprise first, then something closer to confusion, or maybe calculation. He looked past the officers, as if expecting to see someone else, as if searching for another explanation. But there was none. When they placed cuffs around his wrists, he didn't resist. He lowered his head, turned slightly to avoid the doorframe, and stepped into the sunlight where neighbors watched from windows and porches, stunned by the unfolding scene. In the patrol car, he asked just one question. "Is this about the girl from the canal?" Calder answered, "It's about all of them." Hargrove said nothing more. News of the arrest spread across Arroyo Vista with a ripple of disbelief. People who had known Hargrove as the quiet mechanic with a predictable routine struggled to reconcile that image with the accusation. Some said they had always suspected something odd about him. Others insisted they had never seen any sign of violence. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable, and the weight of years behind it made denial feel hollow. The initial hearings drew more attention than the town had seen in decades. The courthouse, a modest building of sandstone and steel, buzzed with a quiet tension each time Hargrove was brought in wearing a simple jumpsuit. He rarely looked at the gallery. He kept his eyes on the table, on his folded hands, or on the floor directly beneath him, as though grounding himself in the only reality he could control. The prosecution built its case carefully. They presented photographs from the original crime scene, soil analyses, fiber reports, and the old logs that documented Lena's torn shoe and the fingernail scraping. Then came the modern DNA findings, clear, precise, undeniable. A forensic expert walked the court through the process, explaining how new technology extracted a profile from samples once deemed unusable. Each explanation created a bridge between past and present, showing how evidence preserved through time had finally spoken. The defense attempted to argue degradation, contamination, or procedural error. They suggested that the old samples could have been compromised. They pointed to the absence of eyewitnesses and the lack of motive. They portrayed Hargrove as a solitary man with a quiet life, someone who preferred machines over people, someone who never sought harm. But the DNA remained unmoved by argument. It linked him directly to the torn shoe and the fingernail scraping. It connected him to the traces found on the watch band of another victim. And once these connections were laid out, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly, as though the truth had finally found a space to stand. Throughout the trial, the Marquez family attended every session. Marta sat on the left side of the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture steady despite her age. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed on the table where the evidence photographs were placed. Neither of them spoke publicly. They didn't need to. Their presence was its own form of testimony, evidence of the years the case had lived in their home, in their hearts, in every quiet moment of grief they had endured. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom filled early. The air felt heavier, as though expectation had settled into every corner of the room. Hargrove sat motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Calder sat a few rows back, his hands clasped quietly in front of him. For him, this moment felt both inevitable and fragile. Cold cases rarely reached this point. Even fewer reached it with such clarity. When the jury filed in, everyone stood. They sat again in a wave of rustling clothing. The foreperson held the verdict slip carefully, as if the paper carried weight. Guilty, the word lingered, solid and unbroken. Guilty on all counts. Nothing dramatic followed. No outburst, no collapse, no proclamation of innocence. Hargrove stared forward, his expression tighter but unchanged. As deputies moved toward him, he offered no resistance. It was as if he had already stepped into the shape of the future awaiting him. The judge announced the sentence: multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The courtroom absorbed the words, their finality rippling outward. Marta closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, a breath that carried 30 years of waiting. Daniel reached over and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined quietly, the gesture small but filled with meaning. For the first time in decades, they felt something shift inside them, not a release of grief, but a release of uncertainty. Calder remained seated as the room began to empty. He watched the deputies escort Hargrove away through a side door, the metal latch closing with a muted click. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The kind of ending investigators rarely experienced, one where the weight they carried for years finally lifted. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light cast long shadows across the steps. Reporters gathered nearby, speaking in measured tones. Some asked the Marquez family if they had anything to say. Marta answered with a gentle simplicity, "We're grateful for the truth." Daniel nodded beside her, his quiet presence conveying everything words could not. Later that evening, the family returned home. Marta walked into Lena's room, lit the lavender candle, and placed the verdict slip beneath the small ceramic turtle that sat on the dresser. The flame flickered softly, illuminating the room with a warm glow. She touched Lena's running shoe, the one she had kept all these years, and whispered, "We found the truth." Across town, Calder sat in his office long after dark. The cold case file lay open on his desk, its pages filled with the history of a story that had resisted closure for decades. He traced a finger along the edge of the evidence logs, the notes written by investigators long retired or gone. He felt a quiet respect for their efforts, fragments of persistence that had carried the case forward. He closed the file gently, not because the story had ended, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. The truth had traveled across years, carried by science, memory, and a single trace left inside a torn shoe. And now it had finally landed where it belonged. Justice, though late, had arrived with steadiness and clarity. And for the first time in a long time, Arroyo Vista felt a little less heavy. In the weeks after the verdict, Arroyo Vista settled into a quieter rhythm. The tension that had once lingered in conversations, in evening walks, in passing glances along the canal, began to ease. It didn't vanish, but it softened, allowing space for something gentler to return. The canal path, once avoided after dark, slowly became a place where people walked again, their steps cautious, but steady, reclaiming a part of the town they had long surrendered to fear. For the Marquez family, the shift was even more profound. The uncertainty that had shaped their days for 30 years no longer pressed against their thoughts. Grief still moved through their home, grief never truly left, but it no longer carried the sharpness of unanswered questions. Instead, it became a quieter presence, woven into the memories they now allowed themselves to revisit without the ache of wondering who had taken their daughter's future away. Marta began opening the letters she once kept sealed in the drawer. She didn't read all of them at once. Some she couldn't finish. But she read enough to feel closer to the woman her daughter had been, not defined by the violence that ended her life, but by the kindness and steadiness that shaped it. Daniel resumed his early morning walks along the canal, stopping at the bend where the streetlight dimmed. He didn't stand there as long as he once did. Sometimes he simply paused, breathed in the cool air, and continued walking, letting the morning carry him forward. The community honored Lena quietly. A small plaque was placed near the canal, engraved with her name and a simple line chosen by her parents. She ran with hope. People left flowers there. Some left small tokens, a ribbon, a stone, a handwritten note. Someone once left a pair of running laces tied neatly together, a gesture that carried meaning without needing explanation. Detective Calder returned to the canal path only once after the trial. He walked the stretch where Lena had taken her final steps, noticing the way the light touched the water, the way the reeds moved with a softer sway than he remembered from the case files. It was a calm morning, and the simple sound of footfalls on the concrete reminded him why the truth had mattered so deeply. Justice had not erased the years of silence, but it had given them shape, turning uncertainty into something that could finally rest. In Lena's room, the lavender candle remained on her desk. Marta lit it each evening, letting its warmth fill the doorway. One night, she placed the running shoe beside it, the one Lena wore on her final run. Its shape had softened with age, the fabric worn thin. But in that gentle light, it no longer looked like an artifact of loss. It looked like a reminder of a life lived with intention, a life that taught others to persist even when answers seemed impossible to reach. The case left lessons behind, not through dramatic closure, but through the slow understanding that truth often moves on its own timeline. Science had uncovered what memory preserved. A fragment of DNA carried across years had become the bridge between past and present, proving that time cannot bury everything. Sometimes it simply holds things in place until the world is ready to see them clearly. And in Arroyo Vista, where dust drifts across old roads and evenings fall quietly over the canal, people began to speak of Lena not only as a victim, but as someone whose story shaped the resilience of an entire town. Her absence had once been a void. Now it was a testament to the lengths justice can travel when it is allowed to move forward, piece by piece. As the desert wind moved through the reeds one late afternoon, Marta stepped onto the porch and looked toward the horizon. The light shifted across the sky, warm and soft, the kind of light Lena used to admire. Marta whispered a quiet thank you, to time, to persistence, to the small, fragile objects that carried her daughter's truth across decades. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.